So welcome back, everyone, to Orthodoxy 201. We are looking at the Logos, which is Jesus Christ, who's the Word of God, the Creator, the Redeemer of the world, and how he, out of his love and his goodness and his wisdom and his power that he shares with the Father and the Holy Spirit, calls things from non-existence into being, and he creates life. And this is the great joy that we have as people made in his image and likeness and participating in his world to share in this life and to see our God as the creator of this life. And we've been talking about some materialistic, secular, atheistic theories about how life began, abiogenesis. And we've talked about the great complexity of even single-celled organisms. We have been spending a little time looking at DNA.
Welcome
Watched
to
the video last time on DNA, spoke a little bit about possible origins of DNA according to these naturalistic theories. And we presented also the theory of intelligent design, which sometimes is believed to be a new theory. However, it's actually the original theory, as the early scientists of the 15th, 16th centuries believed that there was an intelligence behind the created order, and that intelligence was a superintelligence, the intelligence of God himself, and specifically the Word of God, Jesus Christ. So, having looked at the possible origins of DNA, we moved our focus towards this idea of intelligent design, and we saw that there are many things that are designed in our world, and some of them are designed by human beings as well. So we looked at sheet music or computer code, blueprints, even alphabet soup or SpaghettiOs, works of art. This was Mount Trumpmore. And we said that they all really pale in comparison to the design that we see in DNA. That DNA is so complex, so really mind-blowing, that it must have been made by a super intellect. And that super intellect, again, is God himself. We talked about genetic mutations, and this was in our examination of the theory of evolution and how these genetic mutations overwhelmingly damage the DNA because they happen at random. And although DNA is equipped with error-correcting mechanisms that try to perpetuate the passing along of the information stored in DNA, when you have mutations, it degrades that. And those degradations in DNA get passed down and they get passed down. And over time, these genetic mutations not evolve an organism, but lead it to devolution. We spoke about natural selection and how this really deals with the survival of the fittest, that over time, those organisms that are better equipped to survive in their environment, that they will last and the other ones will fade away. But it's not a process by which, coupled with genetic mutations, by which organisms evolve and become better and stronger and faster. It's a process that really weeds out the weakest. As from generation to generation, all organisms become weaker and weaker. We see a genetic entropy that happens over time. And that entropy is not something that is only found in biology, but it's found throughout all of created order. The second law of thermodynamics, the law of entropy, is really the law of corruption, that things don't get better over time. They don't go from disorder to order, they go from order to disorder. We said that cars wear out, flowers die, people get old, and this is a process that governs all of created order. The theory of evolution posits the movement from disorder to order at random, and it flies in the face of this law of entropy. And when we compare laws to theories, laws win out because laws deal with what is observed, theories deal with things that are ideas in people's minds or concepts that haven't yet been proven or shown to be true. We then looked at irreducible complexity, and we said that if you were to have a mousetrap, for instance, you would need all of the parts together at the same time for it to provide any kind of function. And it's the same thing in a biological organism, that there are certain systems that have multiple parts, and those parts have to all be in place for the system to function, or it does not convey any advantage to the organism. In fact, if you had parts for a system that were incomplete or not working together, or they were lacking in some way, those parts not providing any function would be dead weight. And it would actually weigh on an organism and make it not stronger, but make it weaker. So all of the parts in a system would need to be present at once. And that's not something that can be even imagined through the process of genetic mutations and natural selection. Because genetic mutations, again, overwhelmingly degrade an organism, and natural selection happens over a period of time, over multiple generations. We inserted a little humor with this reference to the Wizard of Oz and the scarecrow that lacked a brain, the Tin Man that lacked the heart, and the lion that lacked courage, right? And we said if you were to take out one of these key components, maybe a human being might live without courage, but perhaps not too long. But certainly a human being can't live without a brain or without a heart. That's an example of irreducible complexity. Then we started to look at the question of time, right? Because there are three main components to the theory of evolution: genetic mutation, natural selection, and time. And time is supposed to be the hero of the plot. Time is supposed to save the day. Even the most improbable of things could eventually happen if there were enough time. And we looked at that question of probability, how much time might be needed to go from not having a protein to one being formed by chance. And the estimate that was presented by biochemist Douglas Axe was really a number that it's one followed by, I think it was 27 zeros in years. That's how long it would take for a protein to form at random. And of course, a single-celled organism requires numerous proteins, and not just proteins, but DNA and so many other parts of the cell. So, but the idea of a protein even being formed takes so much time that in the estimated age of the universe, it would be really impossible. So improbable that it would be impossible. We inserted some more humor looking at the Simpsons episode where Mr. Burns, out of his great wealth, decides he's going to have 1,000 monkeys on 1,000 typewriters, and they're eventually going to bang out the works of Shakespeare, the great works of literary history. And of course, they aren't able to do that. He gets entirely frustrated. And it shows really an illustration of what's known as the infinite monkey theorem, which is a math-based experiment dealing with the improbable nature of order coming from disorder, systems being built at random, without design, without an intellect, without a mind. That this is not something that we see happening. So we left off there, and we'll pick up today with junk DNA, and then we'll actually close out our segment on DNA, and we'll start looking at the fossil record. So can I ask Suzanne, can you take this one for us, please?
Junk DNA. According to evolutionary theory, the random, undirected process of evolution should produce large amounts of what is sometimes called junk DNA, part of the genome which is non-coding and doesn't have a specific function. Initially, it was thought that up to 98% of the human genome was junk DNA. useless vestiges of the process of evolution. However, proponents of intelligent design contended that so-called junk DNA may actually have important functions that are not yet fully understood. In 2012, the ENCODE Encyclopedia of DNA Elements project, which was a major research effort to map functional elements in the genome, found that about 80% of the genome showed biochemical activity, indicating that it was, in fact, functional. This research, anticipated by intelligent design advocates, revealed that non-coding DNA plays roles in gene regulation, chromosomal structure, and other vital processes. The finding of functional elements in non-coding DNA reinforces the design hypothesis and undermines the evolutionary framework, which anticipated significant amounts of waste accumulated from random, undirected processes over billions of years. The science uncovers more about the genome's complexity. More is being learned about the remaining 20%, which under evolutionary models was formerly considered junk DNA, a term now considered obsolete by many scientists.
Thank you, Suzanne. So again, the idea of junk DNA is that if DNA is being formed at random, most of the time, things are not going to work out. So if you're looking at the total DNA, which is fashioned over presumably not thousands, but tens and hundreds and millions of years of random processes taking place, a lot of that is just going to be junk. It's not going to be functional. And scientists anticipated that it was 98% junk. And it makes sense. You would think that would be the case because of this idea of DNA being formed at random. However, the studies are finding that actually it's just the opposite, that the DNA that is there is functional. And we are learning more and more about how functional it is as we're starting to understand the design of DNA. DNA could be 100% functional even, but we're not at the point where our intellect is able to understand it yet. So there's still a portion of DNA that we don't quite understand yet. And that portion at this point, though, is much less than it was years back. So the advocates of intelligent design who initially thought that this is not junk DNA said, let's research it more, let's understand it more. And by believing that there was design in DNA, they were able to come to more scientific knowledge. That's the nature of science, by the way. You believe that the universe is intelligible. And for that reason, you study it. And you try to understand its order, its harmony, its mysteries. You try to understand more and more because you believe it to be understandable, that there are laws and there is intelligence behind the creation. So this is an example where having a Christian or having a religious viewpoint or believing in intelligent design actually advances science, where many times it's said to hold science back, right? Because somehow God is an obstacle. God is not the obstacle. God is the way in which we unlock the mysteries of the created order. Okay, let's switch now to the fossil record. And this is important because if evolution were to be true, the fossil record would show us that. We'd be able to see all of these transitional forms and missing links as species evolved over these many years. Can we go to Georgianne for this one, please?
Yes. Darwin expected to find fossil evidence as shown by the dotted lines in the illustration. He anticipated the discovery of more transitional forms, missing links, as the fossil record improved. He explained that the absence of many transitional fossils in his time was due to the incompleteness of the geological record and the lack of thorough exploration. Since Darwin's time, no such fossil evidence has ever emerged, with the exception of imaginative illustrations in textbooks. The missing precursors and transitional forms remain largely missing.
Thank you, Georgianne. Okay, so you see the graph there, or the chart there on the right-hand side. Everything dotted is what Darwin imagined. And because of his work on the origin of species becoming so popular so fast, archaeologists went out and, as best as they could, began to look for evidence in the fossil record. And digs were done all over the world and are still being done to this day. And the fossil record, the data that's come in, is quite substantial. And we'll talk a little bit more about how substantial it is in a moment. Georgianne, can you take this next one too, please?
Sure. The left side of the chart shows the actual fossil evidence recorded by sedimentary layers throughout the world. Evidence reveals that unique animal groups suddenly emerge in the fossil record and then undergo minor variations over geologic time, layering. There are extinctions, but evidence for the emergence of wholly new body types is non-existent. On the right side, Darwin's theory of common ancestry, the basis of his book, The Origin of Species. The supposed emergence of all kinds from ancient ancestors of simpler design did not exist in the fossil record when Darwin published his book in 1859 and hasn't been found since.
Thank you, Georgianne. So on the right-hand side is Darwin's Tree of Life, which presumably would have begun with a single-celled organism, and then over time, you would see the development of multicellular organisms, which in time would develop additional complexity to them and begin to differentiate, eventually forming new species. And in time, you would have the great variety of life that you see today. That should be reflected in the fossil record. But the fossil record is actually shown on the left, and you can see the continuity from different eras to the next, from generations to the next, of the same species. They actually do not come from a single organism. They have their own line of descent, which in a very dramatic fashion preserves the qualities over lengthy periods of time for these species. So you see unique animal groups as opposed to common ancestry in the actual fossil record. Marion, can you take the Cambrian explosion for us, please?
Cambrian Explosion. The Cambrian Explosion was a period of rapid diversification where most major animal phyla appeared. This event marked the emergence of complex body plans and ecological roles, leading to a significant increase in the diversity and complexity of life as seen in the fossil record. Rapid appearance of life forms. The sudden and rapid appearance of many complex animal phyla during the Cambrian Explosion contradicts the gradual step-by-step process of evolution. Such a rapid appearance is inconsistent with the gradual accumulation of small changes proposed by Darwinian evolution. Lack of transitional fossils. The scarcity of transitional fossils, intermediate forms between major groups in the Cambrian period, as evidence that the sudden appearance of fully formed, distinct phyla is inconsistent with a gradual evolutionary process. Complexity of early life. The Cambrian explosion marks the appearance of highly complex organisms with advanced features, which could not have evolved in the relatively short time span of the Cambrian period, according to any evolutionary models.
Thank you, Marion. So the Cambrian explosion is basically the opposite of what Darwin expected to find. Because with the Cambrian explosion, you see these organisms that are complex and they appear out of nowhere. There are no precursors, there's no missing links, and they all appear almost simultaneously in such a short span of time that it even if evolution were possible, which, as we've looked at through genetic mutations, natural selection, and probability, it's not possible. But even if you thought that it was, there wouldn't be enough time for all of these organisms to appear. And there are no, again, precursor organisms, no transitional fossils. They just appear out of nowhere, fully formed and fully functioning with complexity and diversity. Okay, now let's talk about one example, and we'll look at the gray wolf. I want to point out right at the outset, though, if you look on the left at the chart, it actually looks very much like Darwin's Tree of Life, doesn't it? Let's talk about why it looks that way. So can we come back to you, Suzanne?
Example, the gray wolf. The common ancestor of all dogs has been assumed to be a gray wolf-like canine. However, as time passes and new dog breeds are isolated, they arise not through an increase in genetic diversity, but rather by bottlenecking or removing traits, genes, to cause the variety we see in dogs today. As new species emerge, mutations, disease, and entropy increases while genetic material degrades. DNA information is lost as diversity increases. This is the opposite as what Darwin expected. Darwin believed that the most complex of all the species would be the later descendant species. However, the opposite is actually true, as the earlier gray wolf has all the genetic information to generate all the various dog breeds. As new species emerge, they do so at genetic degradation or loss of genetic material. There is no known genetic function that can add genetic information by mere chance, as Darwin imagined.
Thank you, Suzanne. So this speaks to us about how we see diversity within species and how that diversity increases over time, but how it is not because of evolution, it's because of devolution, right? The gray wolf, the ancestor of modern day canines, the dogs of today, had all of the DNA code for the functioning of what it was to be a dog. But as time passed through genetic mutations and natural selection, you see different versions of wolves and dogs coming on the scene. But they are not more advanced. They are the opposite. They are degraded forms. So in theory of evolution, you would imagine that you would see the opposite, right? You would see more advanced features. You would see maybe a dog growing some wings or something like that, or being able to swim underwater, or whatever the case would be. They would have some kind of new DNA and new anatomical functions, and they would become better and better as time passes. But again, we see the opposite happening. And the tree, if you will, is not a tree of improvement, but the opposite. And that's what we learned through the study of DNA and genetics, right? So this is something that it's not one competing theory versus another competing theory. One has no evidence for it, that's a theory of evolution, and the other, we have plenty of evidence. We can follow the genome and see what's taking place that brings about these emergence of new species. Interestingly, the species, they stay within their lines, right? Species don't change from one to another. An elephant doesn't become a giraffe or become a lion, right? They remain elephants, giraffes, and lions, but they, in time, over extended periods of time, begin to lose some of their function, right? So that's the example of the gray wolf. Okay, so let's talk more about missing links, in particular with regard to the fossil record. Georgianne, can you take this one for us, please?
Missing links still missing. Jeffrey H. Schwartz is an American anthropologist, paleontologist, and professor known for his work in evolutionary biology, physical anthropology, and the study of human and primate evolution. He writes regarding the lack of evidence in the fossil record for evolution. The reality is that no meaningful fossils of the intermediary forms required by gradual evolutionary theory have been found today, despite the existence of billions of fossils. The gaps in the fossil record remind us that science is a process of inquiry, not a collection of absolute truths. We must always be open to new evidence that challenges our current understanding. Instead of filling the gaps in the fossil record with so many missing links, most paleontologists found themselves facing a situation in which there were only gaps in the fossil record with no evidence of transformational intermediates between documented fossil species.
Thank you, Georgianne. So this scientist, Jeffrey Schwartz, took a lot of heat for his research and for his writing, which basically exposed the fact that there are not missing links. I mean, I guess there are missing links that are missing, right? They're actually not in existence. And that's really a difficult pill to swallow, because if you were an evolutionist and you went to any museum, pick any one you want, you're going to see diagrams like that central picture there of the transitional forms. And you might even see, maybe online, not necessarily at your local museum, but some kind of fossils that are examples of transitional forms. But in all cases, the big finds that they've discovered as the next thing that's purported to be the missing link, they turn out to be frauds. That somebody connected a skull of an ape with the jawbone of a human being and presented this as a forgery. The one at the bottom is kind of a mockery of that, right? I don't know what that creature is. It's a little scary, but it's supposed to be an illustration of a forged missing link. When you go to see these kind of exhibits at museums, know what you're looking at. They are artistic representations of something that is not found in the fossil record. Many times we go to a museum and we think everything we're looking at is just hard scientific evidence. A lot of it is simply artistic representation of theories. So these missing links are not found. By the way, in that middle diagram, that illustration with the X, that's show that something is trying to load, right? For those of you who are used to seeing that on the internet, maybe in the olden days, you see that more than now. They're still trying to load the missing links. They're still not found. And they have been looking for a long time. They've been waiting for a long time for that X to change into some kind of a transitional form, and it's not happening. All right, so let's continue on. Since we're talking about fossils and we're talking about time and the universe being 13.8 billion years, give or take, according to modern scientific theory, we should also talk about things from an Orthodox perspective. And that's what I'd like to move into, to transition into now.
Age of the universe? From an Orthodox Christian perspective, the age of the universe is generally considered to be consistent with the biblical account of creation, which traditionally suggests a young earth and universe. However, interpretations vary. Some Orthodox theologians believe that the universe is around 13.8 billion years. In either case, this is not a matter of dogma or even official doctrine, but rather falls in the category of pious opinion. The focus is often more on the theological implications of creation rather than on specific timelines. Theologumena refers to theological opinions or interpretations that are not universally accepted or defined as dogma. These opinions can reflect personal interpretations of scripture and tradition, contributing to the richness of theological discourse without being considered essential beliefs. Theologumena can help explore the nuances of faith while maintaining core doctrinal unity.
Thank you, Marian. So if somebody asks you how old is the universe, it's okay to say we don't know. It's fine to say that. We are not in the position as Orthodox Christians to define matters that are unknown to us. and also matters really that are somewhat beyond human comprehension. We can't imagine how something can go from non-existence into being. That's something that it's not within our ability to do so. We can't think of what comes first, the chicken or the egg. There are certain things that we as human beings don't know and will never know. It's kind of like we have at home a very fine cat who we call William. William will never learn calculus. It's not possible. William has limitations, even though he's a fine creature. Human beings have limitations. And one of those limitations is to understand how things can go from non-existence into being, right? How time can come about, how space and matter came into existence. Right? These are things that we can't comprehend. In the book of Genesis, we hear about the creation of the world, but it's told to us in a poetic form, because it's not something that even it were explained in a scientific manner that we could comprehend, because these things go really beyond science, which is a human discipline. Right? What science deals with the way human beings try to understand the world, but it can only address certain matters. It can't address things that are beyond the world. So you can have your own pious opinion on how old you think the universe is, but it would be good, I think, to caution against two extremes. And one is the belief in the literal 7-day creation. And by literal, I mean 24 hours, 7 days, and to dogmatize that. We don't do that in the Orthodox Church. The other is to fall into a certain kind of scientism, where a theory like the Big Bang, which is proposed and supposed to be intellectual and scientific and modern, and is fully embraced either, because the Big Bang doesn't make sense. And we've talked about that in a previous session, and how the very laws that govern the universe now, the laws that underpin our scientific understanding of the world, that they break down as you go back in time, and everything that exists is kind of compacted into no space, right? That is not explainable by science. So it's not, the Big Bang isn't even a scientific theory, although it falls in that realm with that title. And the only reason is because it's a naturalistic theory, that it doesn't have room for God. So, but in both cases, we're talking about the creation of the world, and it's something that is beyond the human mind to understand and comprehend. Okay, so those two main ideas about the creation of the world are presented here. So you have the Big Bang, again, that 13.8 billion year timeline, and then you have the account from Genesis, creation of the world in 6 days, because on the 7th day, God rested. In both cases, again, we see kind of the two extremes, where as Orthodox, we do try to avoid extremes. We try not to err to the left or to the right. We try not to be involved in the polemics and polarization of the day, but we try to hold to the mystery of our Christian faith, right? Knowing what is revealed to us, but also in humility, acknowledging what we can't or perhaps never will be able to fully comprehend and understand. But since most of us have been bombarded with scientific data regarding the old Earth theory, the 13.8 billion year theory, I'll present some information regarding the young Earth theory and some scientific findings with regard to that. So are we back to Suzanne?
Yes, scientific findings. Young Earth. Recent scientific research across biology, geology, astronomy, and anthropology presents data suggesting a younger age for the universe and Earth than traditionally believed. Biological evidence. Soft tissues and DNA in dinosaur fossils suggest recent burial, not millions of years ago. This contradicts conventional dating methods and supports a younger Earth timeline. Dinosaur blood cells blood vessels, proteins, such as hemoglobin, osteocalcin, collagen, histones, and DNA are not consistent with their supposed more than 65 million year age, but make more sense if the remains are thousands of years old at most. Living fossils show lack of evolutionary change over supposed millions of years, challenging the concept of gradual species development over vast time periods. Rapid fossil burial indicates catastrophic processes, supporting the idea of a global flood rather than slow, gradual deposition over millions of years.
Thank you, Suzanne. So did everybody know that we had found soft tissue and DNA from dinosaurs? And it's not in a Jurassic Park movie either, right? That's actually been discovered, which would be impossible if they were 65 million years old. Soft tissue and DNA simply wouldn't last that long. 65 million years is a long time, and we would not find the soft tissue and DNA. Now, just as a point of fact, the DNA that was found isn't enough to reconstruct a dinosaur. So don't worry, the Jurassic Park movie series is not coming to real life anytime soon. But then also we were looking at the living fossils, right? So you have organisms that are alive today, and you could see in the older fossils that they very much are the same as they are today, that the species has not really changed that much over time. And then this idea of rapid fossil burial, which is really important. If you want to get a good fossil, the organism that dies has to be buried quickly, right? If it's not buried quickly, then it's subject to the elements and will decompose much faster. On the right-hand side, you see trees that are wrapped in the different strata of the rock layers. And I wonder if those rock layers were laid down over a period of millions of years, how old must those trees be, right? Are there any trees that live millions of years? The answer is no, there aren't. So the rock layers that are presumed to be millions of years probably are not. The dating that we have been presented, this timescale of 13.8 billion years, is now more or less assumed by people, but it doesn't always match up with the evidence. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about geological evidence. So can we go next to Georgianne?
Yes. Geological evidence. Rapid formation of geological features contradicts slow processes over millions of years. This includes quick formation of rock layers, coal, oil, and opals. Lack of erosion between rock layers suggests rapid deposition, not long time gaps. This pattern is seen worldwide in various geological formations. Observed rapid canyon formation challenges the notion that such features require millions of years to form. Examples include Providence Canyon and Burlingame Canyon. Limited sediment on the seafloor is inconsistent with millions of years of deposition, suggesting a much younger ocean and Earth. Fast growth of cave formations like stalactites and stalagmites indicates they formed recently, not over vast time periods as conventionally thought. Earth's magnetic field decay rate suggests a young planet. Exponential decay is evident from historical measurements consistent with creation thousands of years ago. Presence of carbon-14 in coal, diamonds, and other supposedly ancient materials suggests they are much younger than conventionally dated.
Thank you. So some of you may have been to the Grand Canyon, and I've never been there, but just from looking at photos and hearing from people who have visited, it's a magnificent sight. And the theory is that the common theory is that this is an example of how these different strata of rocks are laid out over a period of millions of years and eroded in the same fashion. Yet we have found canyons that have been formed that look rather similar, and they have been formed quickly. The example also of petroleum or coral, petrified wood, having the carbon-14 in them is like unto finding the flesh of dinosaurs, right? The presence of these things should not be there if they were as old as they were purported to be. We remember also that the reason why, the primary reason why the old Earth model is presented is because that time is necessary for the theory of evolution. It would take a massive amount of time, and as we've seen, it's not even possible with that amount of time. The idea was that you had to have this length of time. So when you find something, when you examine something, you try to plug it into that timeline. I'll give you an example. And this happened not too long ago. So everyone's heard of Mount St. Helens, right? That erupted not too long ago. What was the year? 1986, something like that, right? So they took some of the molten volcanic rock from that eruption and they sent it to different labs. And the labs tried to date it. And when they dated the rock, guess what span of years they got? So they got between 350,000 years to 2.8 million years. Now you might say, well, that doesn't seem right because how old the rock was. And at that point, when it was being tested, it was just about 10 years old. And yet they got these extraordinarily high numbers, which, by the way, are also very distant from one another. 350,000 years and 2.8 million years, that's a long time, right? And why was that? Because it's extremely difficult to do the potassium argon dating on any kind of rock that is going to be less than 100,000 years old. Okay, so to do that calculation, potassium argon dating, you need rocks that are over 100,000 years old. What if there are no rocks that are over 100,000 years old? Then that form of dating actually would give you inaccurate results. An example, again, is what they did with Mount St. Helens. They had a rock that was young and they dated it at these very old and discrepant ages. So sometimes the manner in which we try to examine something or in this case date something is insufficient to tell us the reality of what things truly are. So this is just some geological evidence. And by the way, this material that I've presented to you, this is taken from a number of different sources, one of which is creation.com, which lists about 100 and something different types of evidence for a young Earth, right? So there's evidence for an older Earth, an older universe, and there's also evidence for a younger Earth, a younger universe. So creation.com is a place that if you want more information, you can check that out. But let's look at some astronomical evidence, and then we'll look at some human historical evidence. So, Marion?
Astronomical evidence. Moon's recession rate from Earth is too fast for a billions-year-old system. This suggests a much younger Earth-Moon system. Short-period comets exist despite having lifespans of less than 10,000 years. This challenges the idea of an old solar system. Magnetic fields of planets are decaying too quickly for a billions-year-old solar system. This applies to Mercury, Jupiter's moons, and other bodies. Ongoing volcanic activity on moons like Io suggests that they're young. Such activity should have ceased if they were billions of years old. Instability of planetary rings and orbits contradicts billion-year timescales. Features like Saturn's rings and Pluto's orbit suggest a younger solar system. Spiral galaxies should have wound up beyond recognition if the universe were billions of years old. The existence of hot, massive blue stars which burn out quickly and would not last billions of years, suggesting a younger universe.
Thank you, Marion. So I don't know how much of this everybody is really digesting. Some of this is just simply over my head, but I wanted to present it nonetheless because some of you might be able to grasp all of this. But research is continually being done and they're finding new things about the universe. And that data then has to be interpreted and it has to fit into different models. And some of it fits into an old universe and some fits into a young universe model. So it's just to be aware of that. This, I think, will be more interesting for people, perhaps. And this is human history evidence. So can we go back to Suzanne for this, please?
Human history evidence. Current population levels are consistent with growth from a small group thousands of years ago, not hundreds of thousands. Agriculture's recent origin, about 10,000 years ago, is puzzling if humans existed for 200,000 years. Why did it take so long? Limited archaeological remains don't support humans existing for hundreds of thousands of years. There should be more if humanity were that old. The decay in the human genome due to multiple slightly harmful mutations each generation is consistent with an origin several thousand years ago. Limited genetic variation in humans points to a recent common origin, aligning with biblical creation rather than long evolutionary timescales. Unlike nuclear DNA, which is inherited from both parents, mitochondrial DNA is passed down exclusively from the mother. The data for mitochondrial Eve are consistent with a common origin of all humans several thousand years ago. Very limited variation in the DNA sequence on the human Y chromosome around the world is consistent with a recent origin of mankind, thousands, not millions of years ago.
Thank you, Suzanne. So this is some really fascinating stuff. If human beings were around for some 200,000 years, how is it that they only developed agriculture 7,000 years ago? How is that possible? That's a long time to live as simple cavemen, right? And then also look at the population, which has increased rapidly of late. But if you were to take a low population growth of, say, like 0.5, and in America, the reproduction rate is like 2.2, something like that. So you're taking a much more conservative figure of 0.5, tying in to diseases in ancient times and people not living as long and all of those kind of things, or different plagues and epidemics and all of that. If you were to take that in, if we were around for 200,000 years, you would have an immense population on Earth. If you were to backtrack using the population growth estimate that I just mentioned, you would have the human race being around the biblical age that's presented, which corresponds to the genetic evidence as well, both with the mitochondrial DNA on the side of the woman and also the Y chromosome DNA. You have both pointing towards around the same kind of timeline. One of the things that we do nowadays is we develop statistical models on the computer and simulations. So you can take like the human genome now, and we can observe from generation to generation, average amount of genetic mutation that takes place. So if you take the human genome data that we've got now, and you were to walk back those mutations, you should be able to walk them back to a certain point where, let's say we're at 80% functionality now, and you walk them back till you get to 100%, you get a certain amount of time, a certain number of generations. And through computer simulations, you end up basically at a biblical timeline. So this is really interesting, fascinating stuff that's being found as the research is being done and the data is being collected. And that data then has to be interpreted. And where is that data pointing to? What direction is it pointing to? So a few more things on the historical human evidence. And Suzanne, can you finish this off for us, please?
Sure. length of recorded history, origin of various civilizations, writing, etc., all about the same time, several thousand years ago. Similarities in languages worldwide suggest a recent common origin, supporting the biblical account of the Tower of Babel. Common cultural stories like flood myths indicate a shared recent history rather than separate long-term development of human cultures.
Thank you, Suzanne. So there you see a chart showing the language families, and you see a descendancy going back. You kind of like, you see a tree in inverse fashion here. And then also on the right-hand side, you see a list of the ancient civilizations that all had a flood story. And it's sometimes been said, well, Noah's flood might have happened, but it was developed into some kind of like myth. It was exaggerated. It became a worldwide flood idea. And yet, in these ancient civilizations, which they weren't on social media, they weren't kind of interacting with one another, sharing their mythologies and what they're going to come up with, they largely developed in isolation. They have this flood story. And that's what, that's 15 of them, right? So, and from different parts of the world. So what we see in the Old Testament and the Hebrew scriptures is paralleled in what we see in other literature and other from other cultures. Okay, next time we're going to kind of conclude the section on science and the logos. So I'm going to try to wrap things up next time, and we'll look at the 4 miracles of atheism. And just quickly to mention them: the origin of the universe, the fine-tuning of the universe, the origin of life and diversity, and the emergence of consciousness. So we'll talk about that next time. And then we'll talk a little bit about intelligent design, and we'll kind of tie up some of the loose ends.